The first thing I heard was the diesel engine, a low grumble that vibrated through the floorboards and into the legs of my chair. It was 6:42 a.m. The sun was just beginning to burn the mist off the meadow. I was at my desk, a mug of black coffee steaming beside a set of topographical survey maps I was reviewing for pleasure, the way some men read the sports pages. The sound was wrong. It wasn't the distant hum of the highway or the chug of a tractor from the farms a mile away. This was close. This was the sound of heavy machinery, where no heavy machinery should be. I stood up and walked to the large bay window in my study that overlooked the back of my property. And there they were. Two tandem axle dump trucks, their beds filled high with dark, clumpy fill dirt, were parked at the edge of my lawn, their tires already pressing into the soft grass. Standing between them, pointing a manicured finger toward the heart of my meadow, was Eleanor Vance. She wore a bright pink tracksuit, a ridiculous choice for the damp morning, and held a travel mug that I knew contained some kind of herbal tea she was always evangelizing. She was the president of the Homeowners Association, and she was on my land. I took a slow sip of my coffee. I didn't rush. I watched as the first truck, with a hydraulic hiss and a groan of stressed metal, began to tilt its bed. A cascade of dirt, rocks, and clay tumbled out, forming a muddy brown scar on the pristine green of the meadow. Eleanor took a triumphant sip from her mug, nodding, as if she were conducting an orchestra. She was directing them to dump the fill directly into the swale, where Clara's Creek made its gentle turn toward the west. They were burying the creek. My creek. I set my coffee down on the windowsill, picked up my phone, and pressed the record button. I didn't need to zoom. They were less than 100 yards away. I walked out my back door, across the dew-wet patio, and onto the lawn. I didn't shout. I didn't run. I simply walked toward them, my phone held steady at my side, the lens capturing the entire scene. The air was cool and smelled of cut grass and diesel fumes. Eleanor saw me approaching, a wide, satisfied smile spread across her face. She thought this was a negotiation. She thought this was a discussion. She had no idea. "Arthur, good, you're up," she chirped, her voice gratingly cheerful. "We're finally getting this drainage issue sorted. It's going to be a huge improvement for the community pond." I stopped about 20 feet from her, close enough for the phone's microphone to pick up every word clearly. I didn't say anything. I just looked at the growing pile of dirt. Then at her. The truck bed was still groaning, its load not yet fully spent. "We're just creating a small retention berm here," she explained, gesturing with her free hand as if drawing a diagram in the air. "It'll slow the runoff from your field, let the sediment settle, and keep the pond from silting up. It's been a problem for years, as you know. The board approved it last Tuesday. 40 tons of fill should do it for the initial phase." I remained silent. I let the quiet stretch. The only sounds were the truck's engine, the chirping of a cardinal in the old oak tree, and the steady slide of dirt into my meadow. Her smile tightened just a fraction. My silence was not the reaction she expected. She was used to bluster, to arguments, to emotional responses she could easily dismantle with her brand of condescending authority. "Look, Arthur," she said, her tone shifting from chipper to patronizing. "I know you're attached to your little patch of weeds out here, but this is for the good of the entire neighborhood. Our property values are tied to the health of that pond. Your runoff is a problem. The board has the authority under the covenants to take necessary steps to protect community assets. This is a necessary step." I took a small step to my left, making sure the phone's camera had a clear view of her face, the trucks, and the identifying logos on their doors. She was standing next to one of my property stakes, a small iron pin with a faded orange cap that my surveyor had driven into the ground 17 years ago. She was using it as a footrest. "I will be sending you the bill for the dirt, of course," she added, the threat landing with all the subtlety of the dirt pile. "And a fine for non-compliance with landscape maintenance directives. It's a shame it had to come to this, but you've ignored all our previous more informal requests." This was the first I had ever heard of any request, informal or otherwise. I kept the receipts on everything. The first truck finished its dump, its bed slamming back into place with a hollow clang. The driver of the second truck looked over at Eleanor, waiting for his signal. She gave him a brisk, commanding nod. I finally spoke. My voice was low, calm, and perfectly even. "Eleanor," I said, making sure to use her name for the recording. "What you are doing is illegal. You are trespassing. You are causing criminal damage to private property. You are illegally altering a designated waterway. I am asking you one time to have these men stop what they are doing and leave my property immediately." She actually laughed, a short, sharp bark of a laugh. "Oh, Arthur, don't be so dramatic. It's not your waterway, it's community runoff. We've been over this, the lawyers have assured me. This is all perfectly above board. Now, if you'll excuse us, we have another 20 tons to lay down." She turned her back on me, a clear dismissal. She gestured for the second truck to begin. The hydraulic hiss started again. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't move a muscle. I just stood there on my own lawn, recording the systematic, state-sanctioned destruction of the piece of land my wife had loved more than any other place on earth. And as the second pile of dirt began to cover the wild irises Clara had planted along the creek bed, I made a quiet promise to her and to myself. I wasn't going to get angry. I was going to get organized. Eleanor Vance had just dumped 40 tons of dirt. Not just on my meadow, but on her entire life. She just didn't know it yet. She had no idea who she was dealing with. She had no idea she had just declared war on a man who had spent 45 years as a professional hydrologic engineer, a man who understood water, land, and the laws that governed them better than she understood how to breathe. She had no idea she just buried the only thing keeping her precious community pond from turning into a mud pit. But before I tell you what I did, I should probably explain. This wasn't about a patch of weeds or a pile of dirt. This was about a foundation of promises, both written and unwritten. It was about a piece of paper, a surveyor's pin, and the quiet order of things. My name is Arthur Finch. I am 71 years old. For 45 of those years, I worked for one of the largest civil engineering firms in the state, specializing in hydrology and water resource management. My job, in layman's terms, was to understand how water moves. I designed culverts, floodplains, and municipal water systems. I spent my days reading plat maps, geological surveys, and 1,000-page environmental impact statements. I testified as an expert witness in dozens of cases involving water rights, easements, and property disputes. I lived in a world of documents, of clearly defined lines, of rules that were based on physics and law, not on the whims of a homeowners association president in a pink tracksuit. My wife Clara passed away 3 years ago. We bought this house, this specific 5-acre lot, 20 years ago. We were the first to build in what would become the Oak Creek Estates. We chose this lot not for the house but for the land, specifically for the meadow and the small, spring-fed creek that bisected it. Clara was a botanist. She saw the meadow not as a patch of weeds, but as a complex ecosystem. She spent years cultivating native grasses and wildflowers, documenting the birds and insects that called it home. She named the creek after herself, Clara's Creek, a little joke between us that stuck. The deed was the most important document. Before we even made an offer, I spent a week in the county records office. I pulled the original parcel maps from the 1920s. I traced the chain of title back to the original land grant. I read every covenant, every easement, every restriction, and I found the reason this parcel had remained undeveloped for so long. It came with absolute and explicit water rights to the spring that fed the creek. The legal language was archaic but clear. The water rights appurtenant to said parcel, including the entirety of the waterway originating thereon, are exclusive to the owner of said parcel and may be altered, diverted, or ceased at the sole discretion of the legal owner. It was a relic from an old farming dispute, a legal fortress built around our little creek. To a hydrologist, it was a thing of beauty. To Clara, it meant her meadow would always have water. It was the heart of our home. On paper, that creek was as much mine as the chair I was sitting in. Eleanor Vance moved into the neighborhood about 8 years ago. She was a recent divorcee with a substantial settlement, and an even more substantial need for control. She saw the HOA, which had been a sleepy, informal entity, concerned mostly with organizing the annual block party, as a vehicle for her ambitions. She ran for president on a platform of protecting our investment and enhancing community standards. She won by a narrow margin, mostly because no one else wanted the job. Her reign began subtly. A friendly note about a garbage can left out too long, a suggestion that holiday decorations should be taken down by January 5th. But it quickly escalated. Old Mrs. Gable, a widow in her 80s, was fined $50 because her bird feeder was attracting squirrels, which Eleanor deemed vermin. The Henderson family was cited for their son's basketball hoop, which had been in the same spot for a decade. Lawns were to be mowed to a height of no more than 3 inches and no less than 2. She carried a small ruler in her purse. She had a knack for twisting the language of the covenants. A general clause about maintaining a neat and orderly appearance became her justification for a host of draconian rules she invented on the spot. Most people busy with their lives and unwilling to cause a fuss simply complied. They paid the fines. They took down the basketball hoops. They resented her, but they feared her more. She wielded the threat of lanes and lawyers like a cudgel. I had my own file. I called it the Eleanor File. It started after she fined me $25 for improperly parked vehicle, when my son, visiting for the weekend, had left his car parked on the street in front of my house overnight. The covenants said nothing about street parking. When I pointed this out in a polite email, citing the exact page and paragraph, her response was a second fine for argumentative correspondence. I paid both fines. I paid with a personal check, and when the canceled check came back, I stapled it to a copy of her notice and placed it in the folder. I kept the receipts. The folder grew thick over the years. Notices about the precise shade of beige my mailbox post was painted. Demands that I remove a small stone bench Clara had placed near the creek, because it was an unapproved structure. For each one I would send a calm, factual email referencing the governing documents. And when she inevitably fined me for my insolence, I would pay the fine and file the paperwork. It was a long-term investment in data collection. I knew, with a certainty born of long experience, that people like Eleanor Vance eventually overreach. They build their little empires on foundations of bluster and intimidation, and eventually they push on something that is not just unwilling, but unable to move. A rock. That morning she had decided to push on me. So after I stopped recording and watched the dump trucks rumble away, their work done, I did not go back inside and yell. I did not call my lawyer in a panic. I walked back into my study, sat down at my desk, and got to work. The first step was to establish a formal record. An argument between neighbors is a he said, she said affair. A documented exchange of legal correspondence is the beginning of a case. I drafted a simple, one-page letter. It was addressed to Eleanor Vance, in her official capacity as president of the Oak Creek Estates Homeowners Association. The letter was structured in 3 parts. The first part was a statement of fact. On the morning of April 12th, at approximately 6:45 a.m., you, acting as an agent of the HOA, directed 2 dump trucks to enter my private property, legally described as Lot 17, Oak Creek Estates, and deposit approximately 40 tons of fill dirt into the waterway known as Clara's Creek. I included the parcel identification number from the county tax assessor. The second part was a citation of the law. I cited the state criminal statutes for trespassing and damage to property. I cited the county ordinances regarding unpermitted alteration of waterways, and I cited the specific article and section of the HOA's own governing covenants that explicitly stated the HOA's authority ended at the property lines of its members, except for specific deeded easements, of which none existed on my land. The third part was the demand. You are hereby directed to cease and desist all further unauthorized entry onto my property. Furthermore, You have 72 hours from receipt of this letter to present a professional, bonded, and insured plan for the complete removal of all foreign material from my property, and the full restoration of the affected area to its original condition, at the HOA's sole expense. I printed 2 copies. One I would send to the HOA's official mailing address, via certified mail, return receipt requested. This is a critical step. The signature on that green card is legally binding proof that they received the document. The other copy I would have delivered by a professional process server to Eleanor's front door. It was an unnecessary expense, but it served a purpose. It sent a message. This was no longer a neighborly dispute. This was a formal, legal proceeding. While the letter was being prepared, I made a phone call. Not to a lawyer, but to a surveyor. A young man named Kevin, whose father I had worked with for 30 years. I asked him for a favor. I needed a crew to come out that same afternoon and refresh my property markers. I wanted every corner of my 5 acres marked with a tall wooden stake, brightly flagged with orange ribbon. I wanted my property lines to be visible from space. I wanted there to be no ambiguity whatsoever about where the HOA's authority ended and my rights began. Then, I went back to the Eleanor file. I scanned every document, every fine, every canceled check, every email exchange. I organized them chronologically in a digital folder. I created a spreadsheet logging the date, the alleged infraction, the covenant she cited, or failed to cite, and the amount I paid. It was a clear, undeniable pattern of harassment and arbitrary enforcement. On paper, it was damning. The process server delivered his copy of the letter that evening. I know this because Mrs. Gable called me. Her voice was a nervous whisper. "Arthur, it's Martha Gable. I saw a man give Eleanor a letter. She opened it right on her porch. She read it, and then she tore it into little pieces." She was laughing. I thanked her for letting me know. Her testimony was now a part of the record. Eleanor's contempt for formal process was another piece of evidence. She had no idea how valuable her theatrical performance of dismissal truly was. She thought she was showing strength. On paper, she was demonstrating guilt. The next 72 hours passed in silence. No email, no phone call. The pile of dirt sat in my meadow, a brown tumor on the landscape. The creek was choked, backing up into a stagnant, muddy pool. The certified letter was signed for by the HOA's secretary, a woman named Brenda, who I knew was terrified of Eleanor. The green card came back to me in the mail. I stapled it to my copy of the letter and placed it in a new, thicker folder. This one wasn't the Eleanor file. This one was labeled Oak Creek HOA versus Finch. With the deadline passed, it was time for the next phase. I retreated to my home office, a room lined with bookshelves filled with engineering texts and legal binders. I told my son I would be unavailable for a few days. I put a pot of coffee on and began to work the problem, just as I had worked thousands of problems over my career. First, I assembled my team. I called David Chen, a paralegal I had worked with for the last 15 years of my career. He was younger, sharper, and knew his way around digital records databases better than anyone I knew. I wasn't hiring him in an official capacity yet. I was calling him as a friend and a former colleague. I explained the situation. "So she just dumped dirt on your land?" he asked, a note of incredulity in his voice. 40 tons of it, I confirmed, choked a Class 1 stream. Without a permit from any agency? No permit, no warning, no legal basis whatsoever. There was a pause on the other end of the line, then a low whistle. "Arthur, this is not a normal HOA dispute. This is spectacularly stupid. What do you need?" "I need everything," I said. "I want you to pull the full incorporation documents for the HOA. I want the minutes from every board meeting for the last 5 years. I want the financials. I want to know who their insurance carrier is. And I want a full background check on Eleanor Vance. See if she's ever been involved in property disputes before." "Consider it done," David said. "This sounds like fun." While David went to work on the digital front, I focused on the physical. I had the original vellum plat maps from the development's founding in 1978. They were stored in a climate-controlled tube in my office. I unrolled them carefully on my drafting table. These were the master documents, the source code for the entire neighborhood. Modern digital copies were convenient, but the originals held the signatures, the notary seals, the faint pencil marks of the original surveyors. I spent hours poring over the maps with a magnifying glass. I traced the property lines, the utility easements, the designated common areas, and then I found it. It was a small note, in tiny, precise lettering, near the description of my lot. Lot 17. Note: a natural and unimpeded waterway covenant is attached to parcel 78B. See County Record 45C, page 211. Parcel 78B was the original, larger tract of land that had been subdivided to create the first phase of Oak Creek Estates, including my lot. The note was an artifact, a breadcrumb left by a careful surveyor 50 years ago. I immediately went to the county's online records portal. I navigated to Record 45C, page 211. It took a few minutes for the scanned image of the old typewritten page to load. And there it was. The bombshell. It was a covenant put in place by the original developer, a man named Robert Galloway, who had apparently been an avid environmentalist. The covenant specifically designated the spring and the creek on my future property as a protected natural feature. It explicitly forbade any alteration, impediment, or diversion of the waterway without a written permit from not just the county, but the State Department of Environmental Protection. The language was ironclad. It predated the formation of the HOA by 2 years. The covenant ran with the land, meaning it was a permanent, unbreakable rule that superseded any HOA bylaw. Eleanor hadn't just trespassed. She hadn't just damaged my property. She had, acting as president of the HOA, violated a state-level environmental protection covenant. The potential fines for that were not $25 for an improperly parked car. They were in the tens of thousands of dollars per day. The HOA itself, as a corporate entity, was now exposed to massive liability. But there was more. The covenant explained why the waterway was protected. It was a critical feeder stream for the aquifer that supplied the wells for the entire region. Galloway's foresight was remarkable. He had protected the source and the community pond. The one Eleanor was so desperate to save. It wasn't a natural feature. I cross-referenced the dates. The pond had been dug by the developer 3 years after the covenant was filed. It was an artificial amenity, and its primary source of water was the overflow from my protected, private creek. She had no idea. She thought she was protecting a community asset. In reality, she was illegally damaging a state-protected environmental feature to prop up a decorative water hazard. And the covenant I had found a few years prior, the one giving me sole discretion over the water, that was the second layer of armor. The developer had first protected the stream for the state, and then, when selling the parcel, had assigned the control of that protected stream exclusively to its owner. It was a legal masterpiece. I printed a high-resolution copy of the covenant page. I bookmarked the relevant state environmental statutes. I then turned my attention to the new trail cameras I had installed. I had placed 3 of them, disguised in birdhouses, with clear views of the dirt pile and the access route from the street. Reviewing the footage, I found gold. The cameras had captured clear video of Eleanor visiting the site twice more after the initial dumping. Once she was seen prodding the dirt pile with a garden rake. The second time she brought 2 men with her, who I recognized as members of the HOA's landscaping committee, and they were pointing and planning, clearly intending to do more work. This demolished any potential claim that it was a one-time mistake. This was a sustained, ongoing project. The next move on the board was hers. I knew that my freshly painted property stakes and my stony silence would be more than she could bear. Her power was based on the illusion of control, and my quiet refusal to engage was a direct challenge to it. I didn't have to wait long. It was a Saturday afternoon. I was in my garden when I saw the sheriff's cruiser pull up to the curb. Eleanor was standing on her lawn, waiting for it, her arms crossed, a look of grim satisfaction on her face. She had done it. She had called in the authorities to enforce her will. This was her checkmate, she thought. 2 deputies got out. One was older, with a weary look that suggested he'd seen every kind of neighborhood squabble imaginable. The other was younger, sharp-eyed, and professional. Eleanor immediately launched into her performance. "Thank you for coming, officers," she began, her voice filled with strained reasonableness. "I'm Eleanor Vance, president of the HOA. I'm afraid I have to report a case of harassment and a violation of community covenants. That man," she said, pointing at me, "has been threatening me and is refusing to allow us to perform necessary maintenance on community property." I calmly walked over, wiping my hands on a cloth. I stopped at the edge of my lawn, a good 10 feet from them. The new survey stakes were clearly visible. "Sir," the older deputy said to me, his tone neutral, "Ma'am here says you're preventing her from accessing HOA property." "Good afternoon, officers," I said calmly. "My name is Arthur Finch. This is my property. The woman you are speaking to has been formally notified that she is trespassing." Eleanor scoffed. "It's not his property. It's a community drainage area. It affects the pond. He's just being difficult because he doesn't want to pay the special assessment for the erosion control." The younger deputy looked at me. "Sir, can you show us your property line?" "Certainly," I said. I pointed to the new stake right beside my driveway, then to the one at the far corner of my yard. "My property extends from that stake to that stake, and goes back about 500 feet. Everything you see behind this lawn is my private property, as described in my deed." "That's a lie!" Eleanor shrieked. "The meadow has always been used by the community." The older deputy sighed. It was the sigh of a man who was counting the minutes to retirement. "Ma'am, always been used isn't a legal description. Mr. Finch, do you have a copy of your deed? Or a survey map?" This was the moment. I had prepared for it. I didn't present a sheaf of papers. I didn't try to explain water rights or covenants. I presented one thing. I reached into my back pocket and pulled out a single, clear plastic envelope. Inside was a 1-page document. It was a certified copy of my property deed with a color-coded map attached, the boundaries of my parcel highlighted in bright yellow. "Here you are, officer," I said, handing it to the younger deputy. "That's the official plat from the county recorder's office." He took it and studied it for a moment. He looked at the map, then looked up at the yard, tracing the lines with his eyes. He nodded, then handed it to his partner, who gave it a cursory glance. The older deputy looked from the paper in his hand to Eleanor. "Ma'am," he said, his voice flat, "according to this official document, this is Mr. Finch's property, all of it. The meadow, the creek, everything." Eleanor's face, which had been a mask of righteous indignation, went blank. But the pond, we have to maintain the water flow." "That's a civil matter, ma'am," the deputy said, handing the deed back to me. "We can't force him to let you on his land. In fact, if he wants you to leave, you have to leave, or you'll be the one trespassing." I took the deed back and slipped it into my pocket, and then I delivered the final, calculated blow. "Officers," I said, my voice still perfectly level, "for the record, I would like to make a formal statement. This woman, Eleanor Vance, has already entered my property without my permission. On April 12th, she directed work crews to dump 40 tons of fill dirt onto my land, causing significant damage. I have it on video. I would like to file a report for criminal trespassing and destruction of property. I would appreciate it if you would include that in your report of this incident. I'd also like the incident number before you leave." The younger deputy's eyes widened slightly. He looked at Eleanor, then back at me. He saw the laminated deed. He heard the calm, factual tone. He registered the words 40 tons and video. He knew this was not a simple case of neighbors squabbling over a fence line. Eleanor turned pale. The color drained from her face. Her confident, commanding posture evaporated. She looked for the first time small and uncertain. The word criminal had landed like a physical blow. Now wait a minute, she stammered. I was acting in my capacity as HOA president. That doesn't give you the right to break the law, ma'am, the older deputy said, his patience clearly gone. He turned to me. Sir, we'll write up the report. The dispatcher will give you the incident number. He then fixed Eleanor with a hard stare. Ma'am, I suggest you go back to your house and consult an attorney. This is no longer an HOA matter. They got back in their cruiser and left. Eleanor stood on her lawn, frozen as I turned, and walked back to my garden. The chessboard had been reset. Her queen had been taken, and she was just beginning to realize she was playing against a grandmaster. The official, documented intervention of a neutral authority was a powerful piece of evidence. Her performance had been witnessed not just by me, but by officers of the law, and it was all on paper. The sheriff's visit was a catalyst. It shattered the illusion of Eleanor's absolute authority. The story, as stories do in suburbs, spread like wildfire. But it was the phone call I received that evening that changed the dynamic completely. Mr. Finch, it's Martha Gable. Her voice was still quiet, but the nervousness was gone, replaced by a new, firm resolve. I heard what happened with the sheriff. Good for you, I want to help. Martha, you've already been a great help, I told her. No, I mean it, she insisted. For years she's been bullying all of us. I was too scared to do anything. But what you did, it gave me courage. I have something for you. She told me that after Eleanor became president, she began recording all the HOA board meetings on a small digital recorder she kept in her purse. She would twist people's words later, Martha explained. I wanted a record of what was actually said. She had recordings of every meeting where Eleanor discussed the pond problem, recordings where other board members raised concerns about my property line, and Eleanor dismissed them, stating, I've spoken to the HOA's lawyer, and he assured me we have a prescriptive easement. Arthur Finch is just a stubborn old man. This was a lie, and a potentially catastrophic one for the HOA's lawyer, if he had, in fact, given such incompetent advice. It was more likely she had lied about even consulting him. Martha also had a recording of the meeting where Eleanor announced her plan to dump the fill dirt, a plan that was never formally voted on, but was presented as an executive decision. This was more than just evidence. This was a narrative. This was proof of intent, of a deliberate and calculated decision to violate my rights, ignoring the warnings of her own board. Martha Gable, the fearful ally, had just handed me the prosecution's entire case. 2 days later, I got an email from an anonymous address. It contained a single attachment, a PDF of the HOA's most recent financial statement. There, under the line item, Common Area Landscaping, was a payment of $4,000 to G&L Hauling. The date of the payment was April 13th, the day after the dumping. A quick search confirmed G&L Hauling was the company whose name was on the side of the dump trucks. The sender of the email, I soon learned, was Tom Fletcher, the youngest member of the HOA board. The disillusioned insider. He called me that night. Mr. Finch, I can't stand what she's doing anymore, he said, his voice tense. She's running this place like her own personal fiefdom. She never got a board vote for that dirt. She just did it and buried the invoice in the landscaping budget. I voted against the fine she levied on you, but she pushed it through anyway. A lot of us are tired of it, but we don't know what to do. You've already done a great deal, Tom, I assured him. That financial record is crucial. A coalition was forming. It wasn't just me against Eleanor anymore. It was a growing group of homeowners who were finally willing to stand up. Martha and Tom were the first, but after they saw that the sky didn't fall, others began to reach out. The Hendersons of the basketball hoop incident. An older gentleman who had been fined for having a small vegetable garden behind his house. Each one had a story. Each story was a data point in the larger pattern of abuse of power. Eleanor, meanwhile, was panicking. Her attempt to use the authorities had backfired spectacularly. Her power base was eroding. So she did what cornered tyrants always do. She escalated, drastically. A letter arrived from a law firm I didn't recognize. It was a formal notice of an emergency HOA meeting. The agenda had one item: to vote on a special assessment against Lot 17 for costs related to necessary erosion control and to authorize legal action to enforce community covenants. She was doubling down. She was going to use the full weight of the HOA to try and crush me legally and financially. The letter also included a bill for the dirt, the fine for noncompliance, and now a new, massive fine of $5,000 for creating a hostile environment for board members and contractors. It was a desperate, foolish move. The letter was a gift. It was a formal, written confession signed by her attorney that the HOA had in fact ordered the dirt and was now attempting to force me to pay for the damage they had caused to my own property. It was absurd. It was beautiful. I scanned it and sent a copy to David. His response was a single line: "She's making this too easy." The final preparations were made. David, working with Tom and my other new allies, drafted a formal recall petition against Eleanor, citing malfeasance, unauthorized expenditure of funds, and exposing the association to legal liability. They quietly circulated it, gathering signatures. I, in the meantime, prepared for the meeting. I was not going to bring a lawyer. A lawyer would have made it a fight between two suits. I needed it to be a reckoning between a citizen and an official. I spent 2 days creating a PowerPoint presentation. It was simple, factual, and chronological. Each slide was a single piece of evidence. Each piece of evidence was a nail in the coffin of Eleanor Vance's reign. The night of the meeting, the clubhouse was packed. It was the largest turnout for an HOA meeting in the neighborhood's history. The air was thick with tension. Eleanor's supporters, a small clique of people who benefited from her favor, sat in the front row, looking smug. My allies were scattered throughout the room, their faces grim but determined. Mrs. Gable gave me a small, encouraging nod as I took a seat in the back. Eleanor, flanked by 2 other board members and the HOA's attorney, sat at a long table at the front of the room. She looked composed, dressed in a severe navy blue suit. The mask was back in place. She banged the gavel. "This emergency meeting is now in session," she announced, her voice ringing with false authority. She launched into a prepared speech. It was a masterpiece of performative victimhood. She spoke of her tireless, unpaid efforts to protect their property values. She spoke of the beautiful community pond, a jewel that was being threatened by the selfish actions of one individual. She painted me as an uncooperative recluse who refused to be a good neighbor, who was hoarding a resource, the water that belonged to everyone. Her voice cracked with emotion as she described my hostile and threatening behavior toward her. "We have been left with no choice," she concluded, her voice trembling with manufactured sincerity. "We must vote to approve this assessment and authorize our legal counsel to take all necessary action to protect our community. It is for the good of all of us." She expected applause. Instead, there was a tense, heavy silence. She opened the floor for discussion. I stood up. "I would like to speak," I said, my voice carrying easily in the quiet room. Eleanor's eyes narrowed. "You have 3 minutes, Mr. Finch." "I won't need that long," I said. I walked to the front of the room, carrying a small laptop and a projector. "With your permission, I'd like to present some information relevant to the discussion." Her lawyer leaned over and whispered something to her. She hesitated, then nodded curtly. She thought she could control this. She thought this was my pathetic attempt to argue. She had no idea. I set up the projector. The first slide appeared on the screen behind her. It was a simple title: "A Factual Chronology of Events Regarding Lot 17. On April 12th, at 6:42 a.m., I began. My voice as calm as if I were delivering a lecture on water table dynamics. 2 dump trucks from G and L hauling entered my property. The next slide was the photo from my window. A collective gasp went through the room. They were under the direction of Mrs. Vance. The next slide was a 30-second video clip from my phone. The audio was crystal clear. The room heard Eleanor herself say, "I will be sending you the bill for the dirt, of course, and a fine for non-compliance." Eleanor's face went rigid. The color began to drain from her cheeks. On April 12th, I sent a formal cease and desist letter via certified mail. The next slide showed a scan of the letter and the signed green receipt card from the post office. Mrs. Vance received a copy of this letter, and, according to a signed affidavit from a witness, I clicked again. A scan of Mrs. Gable's notarized statement appeared, describing Eleanor tearing up the letter. She destroyed it. The room was murmuring now. People were turning to look at Eleanor, whose face was a blank mask of shock. Her lawyer was staring at the screen, his mouth slightly agape. On April 16th, Mrs. Vance called the sheriff's department, claiming I was harassing her. The next slide showed the incident number from the sheriff's report. During this call, which was witnessed by 2 deputies, I presented my official property deed, and Mrs. Vance was advised that she was, in fact, the one trespassing. I also filed a formal complaint at that time for criminal damage to property. The murmuring grew louder. Eleanor's supporters in the front row were no longer looking smug. They were looking confused. "Now let's talk about the property itself," I continued, my tone unchanged. The next slide was the official plat map from the county, my lot highlighted in yellow. As you can see, the meadow and the creek are entirely within the boundaries of my private property. There is no easement, prescriptive or otherwise, granting the HOA access. I clicked again. More importantly, there is the matter of this document. The scan of the 1978 Natural and Unimpeded Waterway Covenant appeared on the screen. The key phrases highlighted. This covenant, which predates the HOA, designates the creek as a protected natural feature under state law. Any alteration requires a permit from the Department of Environmental Protection. The fines for violating this covenant start at $10,000 per day. A wave of shock rolled through the room. People were now openly talking, pointing at the screen, at Eleanor. Her lawyer looked like he had been punched in the stomach. He clearly had never seen this document. He had taken his client's word for it, a catastrophic mistake. "By dumping 40 tons of filled dirt into this protected waterway," I said, letting my words sink in. "Mrs. Vance, acting as president, has exposed this entire association, and by extension every one of us, to massive legal and financial liability from the state." And then, I delivered the final, killing blow. "However," I said, "even that is not the most important document." I clicked the remote one last time. A new slide appeared. It contained a single, short paragraph, blown up to fill the screen. It was the clause from my deed. "The water rights appurtenant to said parcel, including the entirety of the waterway originating thereon, are exclusive to the owner of said parcel, and may be altered, diverted, or ceased at the sole discretion of the legal owner." I paused and looked around the room. For those who are not familiar with this kind of legal language, let me translate. On paper, I own the creek. Not just the land it flows through. I own the water itself. This is not an opinion. This is a recorded legal fact. The community pond, which was built 3 years after this deed was recorded, has no legal right to one drop of water from my property. For 20 years I have willingly allowed the overflow to feed your pond as a gesture of goodwill. Mrs. Vance's actions have ended that goodwill. Absolute silence. Every eye in the room was on Eleanor Vance. The mask was gone. Her face had collapsed into a mess of confusion and panic. She opened her mouth to speak, but no sound came out. She looked at her lawyer, who simply shook his head, refusing to even look at her. He was already calculating his own exposure to a malpractice suit. In that moment, everyone in the room understood. She hadn't been protecting their investment. She had been gambling with it, recklessly and illegally. She hadn't been acting on sound legal advice. She had been acting on her own arrogance. And she had lost, spectacularly. Tom Fletcher stood up in the back of the room. "I call for a motion of no confidence in President Vance," he said, his voice clear and strong, and I present this petition for her immediate recall, signed by a majority of the homeowners. It was over. The collapse was total and immediate. The vote to remove her was nearly unanimous. The motion for the special assessment was soundly defeated. The meeting ended with the board's attorney publicly advising the remaining members to comply with every single one of my demands. The aftermath was swift and methodical. The HOA's insurance carrier, notified of the situation and the potential for a massive lawsuit from both me and the state, took over. Their investigators were polite, professional, and utterly ruthless. Eleanor Vance was removed from the board, and the subsequent investigation into the financials revealed years of misappropriated funds and procedural violations. Tom's invoice was just the tip of the iceberg. The HOA, on the advice of their insurer, sued Eleanor personally to recoup the costs of her recklessness, including the cost of the dirt removal and my legal fees. A new board was elected, with Tom Fletcher as the president. Their first official act was to draft a formal, written apology to me and my family. Their second was to hire a team of environmental engineers, a firm I recommended, to oversee the restoration of the Meadow. It took a week. They brought in smaller, more precise equipment. They carefully removed every last bit of the fill dirt, scraped away the compacted clay, and regraded the creek bed to its original contours. They paid for a load of top-quality topsoil and laid fresh sod along the banks. The community began to heal. The new board rescinded every one of Eleanor's arbitrary fines from the past 5 years. Mrs. Gable's $50 bird feeder fine was refunded with interest. The Hendersons were told they could put their basketball hoop back up. A sense of reason and neighborliness returned. People started talking to each other again, not as potential violators of some unwritten rule, but as neighbors. Several of them stopped by my house to thank me, some with plates of cookies, others with just a quiet, grateful word. They hadn't known how to fight her. I had simply shown them that the rules, the real ones, were on their side all along. As for the creek, I kept my promise. I owned the water, and goodwill had indeed been rescinded. But I was an engineer, not a monster. Damming the creek entirely would have caused flooding and ecological damage that I had no desire to create. Instead, I drew up a new plan. On my property, about 50 yards downstream from where the dirt had been dumped, I designed a small, elegant diversion. I hired a crew and, with the proper permits which I easily obtained, we built a low, stone weir. It was a beautiful structure, made from local fieldstone that matched the landscape. It didn't stop the water. It simply redirected about 80% of it into a new channel I had designed, one that meandered through another part of my meadow, creating a series of shallow pools and wetlands. It quickly became a haven for dragonflies and frogs. The remaining 20% of the flow continued down the original channel, enough to keep the ecosystem alive, but not nearly enough to sustain the community pond at its previous level. The pond dropped by about 2 feet. An ugly, muddy ring now circles its edge, a permanent, visible reminder of what had happened. The new HOA board asked if I would reconsider. I politely declined. I explained that the new wetland was a project my late wife had always dreamed of creating, and I was merely fulfilling her wish. It was the truth. It was also justice. Last week I installed a small, bronze plaque on a stone near the weir. It's simple, just 3 words cast in metal. Clara's Creek. Sometimes in the early morning I take my coffee and walk out to the meadow. I sit on the stone bench that Eleanor once called an unapproved structure. I watch the water as it splits, part of it flowing on its old path, most of it taking the new one I created. It's a system in balance, a system governed by physics and by rights that were written down on paper long ago. This was never about revenge. Revenge is a hot, messy emotion. This was about order. It was about the quiet satisfaction of a well-executed plan. It was about the profound difference between what someone believes they are entitled to, and what the documents say they actually own. Eleanor Vance believed she owned the view, the community, the rules themselves. But in the end, all she owned was the consequences of her actions. I, on the other hand, own the water, and I have the receipts. The peace and quiet this morning is deep and earned. The file is closed.